The unicorn, a mysterious creature. It supposedly never existed in reality, yet there were quite credible reports from those who claim to have encountered one. Not to mention that it is mentioned in the Bible as a completely real animal, even as it simultaneously appears in fairy tales and, more recently, in fantasy fiction. If you are a parent of a young girl, then you probably have no shortage of unicorns in your life. It is very likely that your home is filled with them. This obsession has very deep historical roots. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance, in particular, showed an almost pathological attachment to unicorns. They were written about in poetry and prose and depicted in the margins of manuscripts, in paintings and tapestries, on church frescoes, and on gravestones. And here's what's interesting. Ancient depictions of unicorns were incredibly varied. They differed in color, size, and body type. Their horns were of the most diverse shapes. This was primarily because none of the artists who depicted unicorns had ever seen one alive, because they don't exist. But at some point during the Renaissance, the iconography of unicorns became standardized. It was as if all the European artists suddenly became aware of what a unicorn actually looked like. An elegant white horse with a long, straight, spiraled horn on its forehead. It was as if unicorns had been brought to a city zoo and anyone could go and see them. So, how did it happen that Europeans suddenly knew exactly what a unicorn looked like, especially its most valuable and magical part, the horn? Settle in. I'm now going to tell you the story of one of the oldest scams in the European luxury goods market, one that lasted for several centuries and, I dare say, cost billions of dollars in modern money. I'm going to tell you how a unicorn horn was brought to Europe. The earliest written account of unicorns comes from the ancient Greek physician Ctesias, who lived in the 5th century BC. In his work Indica, he described wild asses in India. According to him, they were as large as or even bigger than horses, with a white body and a dark red head. On their forehead was a horn about 1.5 feet long, colored white at the base, black in the middle, and bright crimson at the tip. Cassius claimed that those who drank from this horn were protected from epilepsy and even from poisons. He also stated that it was impossible to capture these animals alive because they were extremely fast and powerful. They were hunted only for their horn, as their meat was too bitter. Cassius himself had never been to India. He wrote about it based on hearsay, creating a book filled with incredible tales, for which the satirist Lucian later placed him in a special part of hell reserved for liars. Nevertheless, thanks to Cassius and later the immense authority of Aristotle, Europe came to believe in the existence of amazing single-horned animals in exotic lands whose horns possessed miraculous healing properties. While Indica is the earliest written source, there are much older images. For example, seals from the Indus Valley Civilization, dating back to around 2000 BC, show what appear to be single-horned bulls. However, these are domesticated animals, which contradicts Cassius' description. And on reliefs from the ancient Persian capital of Persepolis, you can find winged, seemingly single-horned bulls. It's likely they are simply depicted in profile. Later, Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, mentioned a monoceros, a fierce creature with the head of a stag, the feet of an elephant, and the tail of a boar, while the rest of its body resembled that of a horse. It had a single black horn protruding from the middle of its forehead, about 2 cubits, or 90 centimeters long. This description uncannily matches the Indian rhino, which, unlike its African counterparts, has a single horn. So, we see that legends of single-horned animals existed in various parts of the world. They were often based on observations of large antelopes, which hunters saw only from a distance and in profile, or on rhinos, which were difficult to capture alive. But how did this terrifying, fierce beast transform into the gentle, graceful creature that girls, not boys, wear on their shirts? The answer lies in Christianity. Leonardo da Vinci, in his notebooks, wrote, "The unicorn, through its intemperance and lack of temperance, and not being able to restrain itself, and in order that it may seek refuge, gets into the lap of a virgin. And the unicorn does not tolerate any other beast that resembles it, and by hunger it does not tolerate its freedom, but it dies in the lap of the virgin, and so it dies within itself." In modern Bible translations, regardless of language, you won't find any mention of unicorns. They've been universally replaced with wild ox or aurochs. But in older versions, like the King James Bible, unicorns gallop across the pages. Numbers 23:22. God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. Job 39:9. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee, or abide by thy crib? In the late 19th century, scholars concluded that unicorns had made their way into the Bible by a mistake dating back to the 3rd century BC. That's when the first translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek was made, a version known as the Septuagint. The 70 scholars working on it encountered many words that had fallen out of use. One such word was reem. The context suggested the reem was a huge, horned, powerful animal, but useless for domestic work. Its strength was a metaphor. So one of the translators likely recalled Casius's stories of a mighty one-horned beast, and the Hebrew reem became the Greek monoceros, or one horn. From there, it became the Latin unicorn. And that's how biblical unicorns were born. With the rise of Christianity, allegory became a central way of interpreting texts. The powerful, single horned beast from the Old Testament became a perfect symbol of monotheism. The unicorn quickly became a popular symbol for Christ. Its single horn was associated with the cross on which the Savior was crucified. In medieval bestiaries, illustrated collections of animals from the real to the fantastical, the unicorn was depicted as a peaceful, pure creature that could only be captured with the help of a virgin. According to the legend, it would lay its head in her lap and fall asleep, allowing hunters to easily capture it. This image of the pure unicorn submitting to innocence became a powerful allegory for Christ, who took on human form to save sinners. Thus, a fierce, wild beast from ancient texts transformed into a noble, pure creature embodying virtue and spirituality. The Physiologus is a didactic Christian text written around the 2nd century AD. It is, essentially, an illustrated encyclopedia of animals, from the real to the fantastical. Each creature was accompanied by an image and a moralizing story from which its allegorical qualities were derived. This book was incredibly popular for 1,000 years. It was translated into many languages, and numerous beautifully illustrated manuscript copies have survived. In essence, the Physiologus solidified the medieval standard for allegory. This is where the popular legend about how to catch a unicorn alive originates. There is an animal called the dia, an exceedingly meek creature that hunters cannot catch because of its immense strength. It has a single horn growing in the middle of its forehead. But note the cunning by which hunters capture it. They bring forth a young virgin, pure and spotless, whom the animal, upon seeing her, approaches and flings himself upon. Then the girl offers her breasts, and the animal begins to suckle the girl's breasts and becomes familiar with her. Then the girl, sitting calmly, reaches out her hand and grabs the horn on the animal's forehead. And at that moment, the hunters approach. If this story seems a little strange, you're not alone. The innocent maiden's behavior appears suspiciously knowledgeable, as if she's a seasoned pro. The truth is, the Physiologus was not the work of a single author. It was a compilation of anecdotes and legends from various sources. The Christian morality was essentially patched onto an old tale that had a completely different purpose. And so, the biblical unicorn, the mighty, savage beast to which ancient kings compared themselves, began to be associated with meekness, the Virgin Mary, and young maidens. With the adoption of this new iconography, unicorns became much smaller. After all, they had to fit comfortably on a maiden's lap. It went from being a symbol of royal power to a symbol of love, sometimes spiritual and sometimes courtly, of faithfulness and devotion to a lady. Now, a new force enters the picture, one that will forever change the face of the unicorn: commerce. In Europe, a continent flooded with legends about the horn's magical power, an enormous demand arose. Merchants, taking advantage of their customers' naivete, sold all sorts of things as unicorn horns, from mammoth tusks to rhinoceros horns. But the main product, the source of billions in profit, arrived from the north. Soon we will find out what that miracle was. By this time, the unicorn had definitively moved from church frescoes into secular art. The famous late Gothic tapestries depicting the hunt for the unicorn already had a distinctly different tone. The unicorn's submission to the beautiful lady no longer symbolized the salvation of the soul, but rather the taming of passions and devotion to a beloved, in line with the ideals of courtly love. Meanwhile, an important cultural shift was happening in Europe. The Council of Trent prohibited the depiction of unicorns in religious art. Its symbolism had become far too ambiguous. Many in Europe were shocked when the traveler Marco Polo, after visiting Sumatra, described the unicorns he found there. They have the hair of a buffalo and feet like an elephant. They have one large black horn in the middle of their forehead and a head like a wild boar. They prefer to spend their time wallowing in mud and muck. They are very ugly creatures. They are not at all as we describe them when we say they allowed themselves to be captured by virgins. Clearly, Marco Polo was describing the Indian rhinoceros, but his accounts did little to shake the Europeans' belief in the beautiful, mythical unicorn. Even though the unicorn's days as an allegory for Christ were over, its popularity not only didn't wane, but steadily grew. This popularity was now of a purely practical nature. Europe was obsessed with acquiring its horn, which was believed to possess incredible healing powers. This mythical artifact became one of the most expensive commodities on the market. Soon, we will find out what was sold as a unicorn horn and who got rich from this magnificent deception. By the end of the 14th century, a widespread belief had taken hold in Europe that the unicorn, thanks to its angelic purity, could heal and purify any taint or poison. This idea, while hinted at by Ctesias, was made truly popular by the physiologists. This book, which contained the story of a unicorn being captured with the help of a virgin, also told a tale of how a unicorn purified a large lake from a serpent's poison. The serpent symbolized the devil, while the unicorn represented Christ the Savior. This theme became incredibly popular. The unicorn was often depicted on the banks of a river or a fountain, purifying the water with its horn. These illustrations and stories convinced Europeans that the unicorn's horn could neutralize poison with a single touch. And this horn, called an alicorn, became the most valuable possession a person could own. The word alicorn comes from the Italian all'unicorno, which can be translated as the very horn. Alicorns were presented as diplomatic gifts by kings and popes and were used to create scepters and crowns. 2-meter long alicorns served as papal staffs. Most famous alicorns were kept in large churches and monasteries, where they were displayed as holy relics. The most famous was a horn from the Abbey of Saint Denis near Paris, over 2 meters long. It was dipped into water used to treat lepers. Soon, the belief in the alicorn became purely practical. A superstition arose that it would sweat in the presence of poisons. The most coveted gift for influential people became cups and goblets made from alicorn. Since a whole horn was too narrow, they only made small shot glass-sized cups. Alternatively, cups made from other materials would be inlaid with pieces of alicorn. In the 15th century, the Grand Inquisitor Torquemada always kept a piece of alicorn on his table as a precaution. Its value was simply astronomical. When Pietro de Medici's palace was looted in 1495, the plunder included, quote, a whole unicorn horn valued at 6,000 or 7,000 ducats. In 1597, the Republic of Venice offered 30,000 ducats for a single horn, and the deal fell through. When the daughter of Henry II of France fell ill with smallpox, she was treated with a solution of powdered alicorn in cold water. But common people could only afford eau de licorne, water infused with healing properties, by simply dipping the horn in it. The price of an alicorn reached its peak. A whole horn was worth 20 times its weight in gold. In Queen Elizabeth I's royal palace, a unicorn horn was valued at £10,000, equivalent to several million in today's money. Despite the astronomical prices, the authenticity of alicorns were periodically questioned. King James I even conducted his own experiment. He gave one of his servants some poison mixed with alicorn powder. When the servant dropped dead, the king complained he had been sold a fake. This amusing episode perfectly illustrates how strong the belief in the horn's magical power was, despite all evidence to the contrary. And this brings us to the main question. What was this mysterious alicorn? The fortunate owners of a unicorn horn occasionally discovered that their expensive purchase lacked the magical properties they had expected. The reason was simple. The market was flooded with fakes. For instance, the Museum of Arts and Crafts in Hamburg still has a genuine alicorn cup on display next to a fake made of ivory. You might be wondering, how can you fake something that doesn't exist? But by this time, all enlightened Europe knew exactly what a real alicorn should look like. Thanks to the widespread dissemination of illustrations, a standard had been established: a white, long, straight, spiraled horn. Fakes made of ivory had to be soaked, straightened, and then manually carved with circular grooves. Meanwhile, a whole horn cost a fortune, and the average buyer could only afford a small piece, or more commonly, a powder. Alicorn powders were made from anything: cow bones, deer antlers, fossils, stalagmites, and who knows what else. Renaissance authors constantly warned readers that a real alicorn was extremely rare and offered their own methods for verification. Dr. Konrad Gessner of Zurich recommended buying a large piece of the horn. If that wasn't possible, he advised an experiment. Give arsenic to a pair of pigeons, then give the powder to one of them. If that pigeon survives and the other one dies, the powder is real. It was, so to speak, the scientific method with a control group. Another author, David DePomus, offered a more exotic test. Place the horn in a vessel with 3 or 4 live scorpions. If after 4 hours you find that the scorpions are dead, the alicorn is genuine, and there is not enough money in the world to pay for it. The price of alicorn on the European markets remained astronomically high for over 100 years. But by the end of the 17th century, this colossal scam involving real unicorn horns was finally exposed. Prices plummeted, and the alicorn went from being a luxury item to a museum piece. Prior to the age of exploration, when European ships began sailing to all corners of the world, unicorn horns arrived in Europe only sporadically. By the early 17th century, there were about 20 full alicorns in Europe, and no one had the slightest idea where they came from. Pieces and powders, however, were steadily supplied through Scandinavia, where the trade was hugely profitable. Danish merchants brought them to Hamburg and Lübeck, but refused to reveal their sources. However, other Europeans also began to explore the northern latitudes and stumbled upon creatures whose existence started to undermine the belief in the alicorn. In 1569, a man named Goropius, in describing a huge alicorn for sale in Antwerp, expressed cautious skepticism. Sometimes I suspect that this is the horn of some fish, because many remarkable horns are found on fish, and also because this horn was brought from Iceland. In 1577, the English explorer Martin Frobisher, on his second voyage, found a dead fish floating, having in its nose a straight and twisted horn of 2 yards, lacking 2 inches in length, broken at the top. After this, the sailors put spiders in the horn's hollow, and the spiders died. The captain cautiously suggested that they had discovered a sea unicorn. By the 1630s, the reputation of the alicorn and the economic frenzy around it burst like a bubble. What happened? The well-meaning Danish merchants, wanting to validate their product, approached Professor Ole Worm, a renowned zoologist and owner of a vast collection of curiosities. They asked him to provide a certificate of authenticity for their goods. Professor Worm conducted his research and published a report in which he declared that alicorns were not horns at all, but teeth. Specifically, they were the teeth of narwhals, a type of whale found in the northern seas. As proof, he presented a narwhal skull where the tusk protruded from the upper jaw. The Danish merchants regretted 100 times over getting involved with a scientist. But the story couldn't be contained. A few years later, Worm's friend and relative, Thomas Bartholin, published a monumental work in Latin, New Observations on the Unicorn. He meticulously analyzed all known horned creatures and unequivocally stated that what apothecaries were selling all over Europe was a narwhal tusk. In the present day, the growth of trade with Greenland and Spitsbergen has revealed the nature of the tusk and its availability. In recent years, our merchants have filled whole cargo ships with this supposed horn and would import it into Europe as a genuine alicorn. If experts had not torn off the mask and recognized that this tusk comes from the ocean. Bartholin, however, made a clever twist. He argued that even though a narwhal tusk wasn't a unicorn horn, it still had undeniable medicinal qualities. According to the beliefs of the time, all land animals had sea counterparts. The narwhal was the sea unicorn. So, despite the revelation, princes and commoners alike continued to demand alicorn from their doctors for another 150 years. The price of narwhal tusks, however, plummeted due to market oversaturation. It would take the entire 18th century for European doctors to openly dismiss the practice as quackery. By the 19th century, the unicorn had fallen from its pedestal as a great religious symbol to a pink plush toy and a character in children's fantasy. It never recovered from its public humiliation. The moral of the story is simple. Don't be fooled by the illusory value of authenticity. How is an original Leonardo da Vinci painting better than a high-quality fake? It's not. They are both equally useless, just like a genuine and a fake alicorn.